They were auctioning off a nun, not cattle, not a horse. A woman of God, barefoot, bleeding and bound, standing on a wagon like a thief, while a crowd of men laughed and placed bids like it was a poker game. That's where he saw her. And that's where everything changed. What happens when a man who's lost his faith meets a woman who's lost everything but hers? What happens when a silver cross falls to the ground and a broken soul dares to pick it up? This story isn't about saints or sinners. It's about what lives in between, where silence speaks louder than sermons and love walks slower but steadier than fear. If you believe that sometimes God works through strangers, or if you've ever wondered whether mercy still has a place in this world, then don't scroll away. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because what you're about to hear might just remind you how faith finds us when we least expect it. She stood on that wagon like a broken statue, her black habit torn at the edges, her veil ripped away, head covered in a dirty sack. Her bare feet bled into the splintered boards. Hands once folded in prayer were bound with rope, tight and cruel. She was a nun, a woman of God, and they were auctioning her off like a mule. $1, barked the fat man, his voice thick with whiskey and mockery. Your own holy woman, a preacher pet for your porch, and the crowd laughed. Old men with cracked boots and sunburnt necks, young boys with hollow eyes and dust where their souls should have been. Their laughter didn't just echo, it stung. It stung because it was public, loud and proud, evil with an audience. And off to the side, Caleb Morgan stood still. He wasn't a hero, just a widowed farmer who'd learned to keep his head down since Gettysburg. He'd seen blood, mud, boys crying for their mothers, but nothing had prepared him for this. Then something happened. The woman, the nun, staggered, not from pain, from shame. And as she dropped to one knee, something slipped from beneath the sack covering her face. A small silver cross. It hit the wood with a soft clink, a sound too sacred for a place so foul. Caleb stepped forward. He bent down and picked up the cross. His fingers trembled. Maybe it was from the war. Maybe it was something else. $1, he said, voice flat but clear. Just like that, the crowd shut up. The auctioneers smirked. Sold to the lonely farmer. There were jeers, snickers. But Caleb didn't hear them. He was already climbing that wagon. He cut the ropes, pulled off the sack. He expected to see fear, weakness, some hollow-eyed soul lost to this cruel world. But what he saw were eyes like burning embers, shoulders squared, a face covered in dirt but not defeat. She didn't flinch. She didn't thank him. She just stood there, proud, silent, watching him with something deeper than fear defiance. Caleb handed her the fallen cross. She looked at it but didn't take it. Not yet. And maybe that's when it started. The war that wouldn't be fought with rifles this time, but with silence, trust, and something neither of them could name just yet. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she came from. But the moment he touched that rope, the moment he picked up that cross, he knew this wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was calling. And in a land where faith had gone quiet and decency had dried up like a creek bed in July, Caleb Morgan, just a farmer, had answered. If this story's already stirring something in you, take a moment to hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe. We've only just begun. And what comes next might just stay with you. Caleb didn't speak on the ride home. Not because he was trying to be mysterious. Truth was, he just didn't know what to say. He'd lived alone since Mary passed 7 long, quiet years. Silence had become his closest companion. But now, riding beside him barefoot and bruised, was a woman in a torn habit. A nun. A woman who hadn't said a word since he cut her down. She walked behind the horse like she was carrying more than just exhaustion, like she was dragging the weight of heaven itself. The silver cross he'd picked up back at the auction still sat in his shirt pocket. He didn't know if she'd noticed he'd kept it. Maybe she had. Maybe she just didn't care. Or maybe, and this haunted him, maybe it meant nothing to her anymore. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was slipping behind the hills. The place looked smaller than he remembered. Tired even, like it knew it was about to witness something sacred or dangerous. You can stay in the barn, Caleb said, pointing. Clean water inside, cotton bedding. It ain't a convent, but it's safe. She gave no sign she heard. Just walked past him, quiet as a shadow. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The silence had changed. It had a presence now, a pulse, a tension hanging in the dark between two people under two separate roofs, both unsure what came next. The next morning, he left cornbread and coffee on the porch. When he returned at noon, the plate was empty. Still, she hadn't said a word. And yet things shifted. One morning, the barn gate latch, busted for years, was fixed better than he ever could have managed. Another day, his torn flannel shirt was mended, the stitches clean and tight. She was speaking, not with words, but with hands, with actions. Still, she hadn't touched the cross. Caleb began talking, not to her exactly, just aloud. About the weather, the cattle, the ache in his knees. And though she never answered, he could feel her listening. In the way she paused when he spoke, in the way her shoulders softened. But one thing stayed the same, that silver cross remained untouched, sitting where he left it on the windowsill. Until one stormy night. Rain came in like a freight train. Thunder cracked the sky in two. Caleb ran out to secure the barn, and there she was, standing barefoot in the doorway, soaked, staring at the heavens like she was waiting for judgment. "Get in," he shouted over the wind. "You'll catch your death." She didn't move until lightning struck so close it shook the ground. He grabbed her arm, pulled her inside, slammed the door behind them. And for the first time, she looked scared. Not because of the storm, but because in that moment, she was no longer just surviving. She was vulnerable, human. And that more than anything terrified her. The next morning, the silver cross was gone from the sill. And when he passed her in the garden, he saw it, resting once again at the hollow of her throat. Faith, it seemed, was finding its way home. If any part of this is starting to feel familiar, and drop a comment below. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones we carry the longest. After the storm, everything felt different. Not louder, not busier, just changed, like the air had settled around them in a new way. Caleb didn't ask about the cross. He didn't need to. He'd seen it glinting softly against her chest as she worked in the garden that morning, nestled once more where it belonged. She still hadn't spoken. But silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like understanding. Every morning, Caleb left a fresh plate of cornbread and hot coffee on the porch. And every morning, the plate came back clean. But now, she didn't wait until he left. She'd begun sitting at the edge of the steps, never too close, never saying a word, but close enough to hear him when he talked. He spoke about the land, about Mary, his late wife, about how the war had taken more than lives, it had taken peace. And while she never replied, he could feel something building between them. Like two people on opposite sides of a river slowly finding stones to step across. Then one morning, he found something that stopped him in his tracks. An old saddle he'd thought was lost weeks ago, cleaned, repaired, and placed neatly on the porch rail. And next to it, drawn softly in the dust, was a prairie flower. He stared at it for a long moment. Then that night by lamplight, he dug through Mary's old books until he found it, page 47 in the botany journal. Ayana, a wildflower. And in the Comanche language, it meant eternal bloom. The next morning, when he set down the breakfast tray, he said it softly, not as a question, as a knowing. Ayana. She didn't look at him, didn't move, but her hand paused just slightly before lifting the plate. He said it again the next day, and the next. And each time, her eyes lingered a little longer. Then one quiet morning as he worked the fence, she walked up beside him, and for the first time, spoke. Caleb, just his name, soft and steady. But it froze him in place. It had been so long since anyone had spoken his name like that, with reverence, not pity. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. She mended his shirts. He read aloud in the evenings. She sat on the porch while he sharpened tools. The cross never left her neck now. And sometimes, just before dusk, she'd hold it gently between her fingers, not in fear, but in reflection. There was no promise between them, no grand confessions. Just two souls, rebuilding one fence post, one stitched sleeve, one whispered name at a time. And in that quiet space between them, Caleb began to believe again. Not just in her, but maybe, just maybe in God. If this story's touched something in you, so far go ahead and subscribe or share a thought in the comments. Because sometimes what starts in silence leads to something worth standing for. Peace has a way of settling in without much fanfare. There were no trumpets, no hallelujahs, just quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, the creak of the barn door, and two people who no longer had to fill silence with words. Ayanna had begun humming softly as she worked the garden hymns Caleb hadn't heard since Mary's time. She never sang out loud, but the melodies were there, threading through the rows of beans and corn-like prayers laid into the soil. Caleb read to her in the evenings, stumbling over the hard words. Sometimes she'd smile when he mispronounced something. He lived for those small smiles. They were like sunbreaks through storm clouds. The silver cross never left her neck now. She touched it often, not out of fear, but reverence. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was her tether, her anchor, a reminder that faith, no matter how battered, still had a home. But the thing about peace is it never lasts forever. One hot afternoon, Caleb was mending a fence post when he saw dust on the horizon. Not the kind that comes from wind or cattle. The kind kicked up by hooves. 4 riders, fast. He stood up slowly. Ayanna, he called, steady. Go inside. Lock the door. She looked up from her garden eyes, narrowing at the oncoming riders. Without a word, she slipped into the cabin and shut the door. The men didn't slow down. They rode in bold, half-drunk and loud, the worst kind of men. Ones who'd come looking for trouble with no plan on how to handle it when it answered back. Garrett Sloan led the pack. He dismounted boots heavy in the dirt. Afternoon Vance, he sneered, using Caleb's surname like a curse. Heard you've been playing house with stolen holiness. Caleb didn't move. She's not stolen, he said simply. She's my wife. Garrett laughed, sharp and bitter. You think that changes anything? He nodded at the cabin. She belongs to the church, and before that to me. Bought her fair in town. Don't think God gets to rewrite that. Then he spat, right in the dirt. Ayanna stepped out before Caleb could speak. Not with a gun, not with words, but with her head high and the cross gleaming on her chest like polished silver. She stood beside Caleb without flinching. She's not going anywhere. Caleb set his rifle already in his hands. Garrett stared at her. That cross ain't gonna save you, sister. You think God cares what you've become, but Ayanna didn't blink. She reached up and held that cross tight in her hand. And in that stillness, she said more than any sermon ever could. She wasn't just a nun anymore. She was a woman of God who'd already faced hell and come out whole. Garrett backed away first, mumbled something under his breath. His men didn't follow him in. They weren't ready for the kind of war that didn't bleed. And as their dust faded into the horizon, Ayanna and Caleb stood steady, 2 quiet believers in a world that had long forgotten how to kneel. If this moment stirred something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a quiet truth, take a second to subscribe or share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us we're not alone. The riders were long gone, but the dust they stirred took its time settling. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but something deeper, like his heart was holding its breath. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the stars blink through the dark. And when Ayanna stepped outside barefoot and silent, he didn't flinch. She just stood beside him, close, but not touching the silver cross, catching the moonlight like a quiet flame. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. The threat had passed, but something else had arrived. Peace. Not the kind that comes easy, not the kind you stumble into. This was the kind you earn with bruises, silence, patience, and 100 small acts of trust. In the days that followed, the ranch felt different. Brighter somehow, like the land itself had exhaled. The soil gave more. The barn, didn't creak as much. Even the wind, usually sharp and restless, seemed to soften when it passed through the garden Ayanna now tended with care. She didn't hide anymore. She moved freely, shoulders no longer tight with caution. She sang sometimes real singing, now soft hymns in the Comanche tongue that Caleb didn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. Songs of survival, of hope, of grace. One morning, Caleb found the old chapel bell rusted, half buried under brush near the back of the barn. Ayanna helped him pull it free, clean it up, and hang it by the porch. It rang once at sundown, every Sunday after that. Not for a congregation, just for them. A ritual, a reminder that some faiths don't need walls or pulpits, just two people who refuse to let the world steal what God gave them. Caleb had stopped calling her the nun in his head. Now she was just Ayanna, his partner, his peace, his answered prayer. Sometimes he still thought about Garrett Sloan, wondered if he'd come back with more men, more fire in his gut. But the thought didn't shake him like it used to. Because if Garrett did return, he wouldn't be facing a frightened woman and a lonely widower. He'd be facing something stronger. Two people who knew what it meant to lose everything and still choose to love. Ayanna wore the cross now, not as a wound, but as a banner. It didn't weigh her down anymore. It lifted her up. A symbol, not just of what she believed, but who she chose to be. And Caleb. He didn't just believe in God again. He believed in second chances, in redemption that comes quietly, in love that doesn't need to be loud to be real. If you've come this far, maybe you know what that kind of peace feels like. Maybe you've earned your own version of it. And if you haven't yet, don't worry. Sometimes peace doesn't find you until you've been broken enough to recognize it when it comes. This story isn't just about a rescued nun or a lonely farmer. It's about what happens when grace walks in wearing dust-covered boots and silent prayers. It reminds us that God doesn't always thunder from the heavens. Sometimes he sends help through the hands of a stranger, a plate of cornbread, or a name spoken gently after years of silence. Ayanna and Caleb's journey speaks to the quiet strength of love, the healing power of trust, and the redemption found in everyday mercy. Their peace wasn't given, it was earned. And that's the message God leaves us with, that no soul is too lost, no vow too broken, and no wound too deep for him to restore. If you've been wandering through storms, take heart. Sometimes the cross you carry becomes the very thing that leads you home. If this story spoke to something inside you, maybe reminded you of love loss or a faith that once felt far away, then don't leave just yet. Go ahead and hit subscribe, give it a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them. And if you're still with me, still listening, then I think you're ready for the next one. It's the story of a runaway nun, a blood-stained Bible, and the night a child was left at the chapel door. Click the next video and I'll meet you there.